So Diablo IV is seeming to get some pretty massive game overhauls at the end of 2025, and we've gotten multiple pieces of information pointing towards this being the case, and just almost outright being told that this is happening. Adam Fletcher recently talked about that some of these big overhauls are coming with the PTR for Season 11. We also got a recent Burning Questions video on the official Diablo YouTube channel, and they put a pretty big tease within this video as well. They asked one of the developers what their favorite season is, and he said the holiday times around November or December, obviously a tease towards when we're getting these upcoming big overhauls. Now, with that being the case, I want to start to go over some of the really big changes I want to see going into these big overhauls. Now, I know a lot of these overhauls are already made, but I think the more feedback we can give, the better the game will just end up becoming. And I think there's some really big changes that could be made to some of these fundamental systems that would just make the game significantly better without even needing to add any new stuff necessarily. Now, the most requested overhaul obviously being skill trees, and this system really hasn't been expanded upon in the majority of the history of Diablo IV. We pretty much only got a new ultimate skill with the expansion, and we got some additional pathing routes allowing you to take a skill and go into some of the passive branches a bit more easily. Outside of that, besides like balance changes and things like that, there really hasn't been any major updates to the skill trees. And not only is that one of the biggest issues with Diablo IV right now, but I think there's a really high chance that this is pretty much the first thing we're getting as a big overhaul, because not only is this just the most requested thing, but the skill tree is just so integral to the rest of the game that you really need to do this as one of the first overhauls to be able to overhaul a lot of the other systems throughout the game. And I think we actually know a few of the things that they want to do with these skill trees that would come with an overhaul or an expansion to the skill trees. Now, the first thing that I think there's a pretty decent chance we see with this skill tree overhaul is something we actually got teased a long time ago. This was around the time we got the tempering and masterworking systems, because the developers were essentially asked about the system, any expansions we could see specifically for the tempering system in the future, and the developers kind of teased that there would be ways to change the elemental damage of certain skills through the tempering system. But I think since that point, a lot of development of Diablo IV has changed paths, and I do think with a big skill tree overhaul, I think it's a pretty good opportunity and a pretty good chance they would want to add a lot more ways to change the elements of pretty much every skill throughout the skill trees, or at least ones that you could effectively change the elements of. I think that would be one of the first things they should really do for big skill tree changes, because there are so many different effects and ways to scale damage that you can almost completely change if you could change the element of a skill. Now, there are already some ways to change the element of skills or add different elements to skills to do different things, but there first off isn't a ton of those. If there are some of those, it's usually like just being able to change druid or skill to also deal poison damage or changes damage to poison or something. It's usually very specific to one thing specific to that class, and you can't change a bunch of the skills elements, and you can't change, say, like a druid element to fire damage or something. It's really confined to the very specific elements that those classes use. And again, it's still not very widespread. There's some of them within aspects and some of them within your skill trees, and there's not much past that. Doing a massive overhaul to a skill tree, a really big thing they could do is just allow you to change the element of skills in many different ways. Allow me to make a druid and change boulder to be a fire boulder. So now I could play a boulder druid build where instead of having earth rocks spin around me, now there are these big boulders that are caught on fire and they're doing fire damage. Or I could change it to poison damage, or I could play a sorcerer and change my hydras into like poison damage, or change them into frost damage, or anything like that. Just being able to change the skills element, and then you would also want to be giving more ways to scale your damage based upon those elements. And that would be a pretty big expansion of the skill trees, just adding those possibilities by themselves. Now, I think the biggest change that developers have specifically talked about wanting to do when it comes to a skill tree overhaul is taking all of the gameplay choice out of the aspect system and putting it into the skill tree. So right now, a lot of aspects will have a gameplay style change and a power aspect to them. And a lot of these legendary aspects actually determine how your build plays. Like for instance, if you're playing a pulverized druid, one of the most important aspects for pulverized druids for the entirety of the game's history is the shockwave aspect, where normally pulverize is just an AoE in front of you, but now with the shockwave aspect, it makes pulverize also do another attack that just does a massive long range pulverize that could potentially hit like everything on your screen. Without this legendary aspect, you basically can't play a pulverized druid build. There's basically no way to do it, and this is a massive gameplay change to that ability. And there are a bunch of these for every single class, and that's why so many slots of so many builds are forced to be taken up by these aspects, and you can't really change them. But imagine all of those gameplay changes in the aspect system. Imagine taking all of those out and putting them into the skill tree. Not only would that at minimum require a massive expansion to the skill tree, but I think it would actually require a full overhaul of the skill tree, the pathing, and how the skill trees in the game work. But this would also just allow for so many more builds to exist, because you can get those gameplay changes in the skill tree, but then the aspects would turn into primarily a power system, meaning those aspects that were guaranteed and required for a build to actually work could be changed out. Because you take away all of the gameplay changing things from aspects, they're just power increases. Now you have so much more flexibility to add in different uniques with cool effects, or add in different aspects that may buff up other parts of the build. And all in all, this would just add a massive amount of new build possibilities and would just be so much more fun and interesting for just customizing your playstyle when you have a much bigger skill tree and all or most of the gameplay changing options are within that skill tree. So if there was something that I would to pinpoint that would be the one guaranteed thing we know is in skill tree changes, it would be this: taking the gameplay changes from aspects, putting them in the skill tree, and having aspects only be power increases. Now, another really big addition they could add to these skill trees, and the thing that I think I want the most in a skill tree overhaul, is what you could call quantity manipulation. And what I'm meaning by that is essentially like recasting or double casting or multi-projectile. Pretty much anything that can proc like additional casts or additional projectiles or anything like that. That stuff has just always been super fun to me in any RPG or even MMO. That's just always been super fun and interesting gameplay changes to me, where let's say you have like a basic fireball build by like a sorcerer or someone. You're just shooting out fireballs in front of you, where there could be like an upgrade in the skill tree and a skill tree overhaul that just gives it a chance to multicast multiple more times or something. So now you could like triple shoot fireballs based on some percentage. And then maybe if the skill tree overhaul was really big and there was more branching paths, maybe one of the branching paths can make the fireballs like much bigger. So now you can multicast and have a chance to make these multicast like much bigger projectiles that deal more explosive damage or something. Or you could just go into more quantity manipulation, and now it has a chance to just shoot out more projectiles in like a cone in front of you. So you shoot out one, and then it has a chance to just shoot out 5 fireballs, but they're all spread out. So it's not like 5 in a row like the multicast would be, but those would be mixed together as you're progressing throughout the passives. So now if you wanted to, you could have the multicast and the multi-projectile. So now you would have a chance when firing your fireball to shoot out 5 fireballs as a cone in front of you, and then it could also proc the multicast, so all 5 of those fireballs now shoots out a row of 3 instead. So instead of shooting 1 fireball, you can now potentially shoot out 15 in this big spray of fireballs. And even just changes like that just goes such a long way into being able to customize your build and make things super fun. That wouldn't even necessarily be super good, because you may have other choices that like massively scale your damage, or add some other effect that allows you to scale your damage, or some other really strong effect that massively increases your power that may be stronger. But just the option to have this like spraying out of fireballs everywhere is just super cool and just really fun, even if it's not the strongest thing. And quantity manipulation doesn't just have to be like an additional chance to spray out more of the same projectile. You could also do it for other skills and change them in some way. So let's say you're playing a tornado druid build where you're just spamming out these tornadoes that spin around and follow enemies around. Well, maybe one of the first branching choices of a tornado is you either massively increase the size of the tornado and maybe increase its damage, or maybe have it like pull enemies to it or something. So now you're shooting out these these really big tornadoes. Or you could choose the other branch where instead of shooting out one tornado, you randomly shoot out a volley of tornadoes, but those tornadoes are smaller and maybe deal some amount of reduced damage. That could still be a really cool choice. Now, I hope if they start adding these kind of smaller negatives into some of the options that they don't go overboard with this. That's one of the issues I think PoE 2 still has right now, is that pretty much everything you go into has some like massive downside as well. So it feels like you're never just getting an increase. It always feels like you're also getting a massive reduction. But having strategically placed reductions while also giving you a really cool new effect could be just really strong. So now maybe you just have like a 50% chance to shoot out like a volley of 5 tornadoes that all just spew out and then all start chasing enemies around. And then maybe you could just get some other power through a unique or through some other passive that pulls enemies together, that either pulls them to you, or maybe you could get another one that pulls them to the tornadoes. So now you could just be spewing out a bunch of smaller tornadoes, but you have some other effects to try to clump them up. Or maybe even a branching path further down the road would have all of your tornadoes have like a lightning effect to them, to where they cause this chain lightning. So maybe that chain lightning would be much better with these smaller tornadoes, because maybe it doesn't scale off their damage. Maybe it just has its own base damage. So having a lot more smaller tornadoes would mean all of this new lightning effect would just be better with those and not as good with the really big tornado. So there's just so many more options you can add in and tie into projectile manipulation that I think this would be one of the best additions to a skill tree overhaul. So I very much do think that a skill tree overhaul is probably one of the first things we're going to be seeing with these upcoming overhauls, because everything we've been being teased about these overhauls, it seems like they're essentially working on Diablo 4 2.0, where they're trying to overhaul a lot of the kind of base systems. And it sounds like, especially based upon some of the content creators that got to go test this stuff at the Blizzard campus, it sounds like these things are not just overhauls that we've been seeing with a lot of the system overhauls we've been getting to like the end game content. It sounds like these are much more so kind of a fundamental changing of Diablo 4 as a game as a whole, because some of the content creators that got to go test this were not only really surprised with some of the things that were shown, but some of them were essentially saying that all of their criticisms since Diablo 4 has been released is essentially being answered with these overhauls, or at least the Diablo 4 developers are attempting to do this overhaul based upon all of that feedback. Whether it comes out really well or really bad is anyone's guess, but I do think this is the general way we would be seeing a skill tree overhaul. Hopefully a lot more options, a lot more of the gameplay style choices going from aspect going into the skill tree, and I'm very much hoping we get a lot more elemental changing choices and projectile manipulation choices, because again, that's just one of the funnest things for ARPGs. Instead of shooting out one fireball, you shoot out a big spray, have 15 of them. Even if it's not the strongest option you have, it's still just incredibly fun. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.